record this with video so that we can have it for posterity, and we can have some fun with that later on. You can share it with, it'll be on our website. Well, anyway, friends, I just wanted to welcome you all here today to how to think about science in the age of evolutionism. It's going to be an interesting seminar. I hope that you have your study sheets with you, and we're going to fill those out as we go along, just to have you, so you can have something to take with you when you leave. We also, if you've registered back there, we are going to be giving away several books. Three of them are going to be in 6 days, Why 50 Scientists Believe in a Literal 6-Day Creation. And of course, obviously don't believe in evolution. We're going to be giving away 10 of the books by a man named Dwight Nelson on creation. You're going to really like that. And there'll be some other books back there, that one that I had written called Have You Swallowed the Hook? That'll be available back there as well. So I want to thank you for coming to this presentation. And we're going to lower the lights down a little bit so you can see the screen a little better. And at this time we're going to begin our program. I know that, how many of you are interested in the subject of science? Or, yeah, a few of you. How many of you are interested in the subject of creation? A few more, yeah. Well, you know, I am as well, and I have been studying this, and you see all this. One brother out there, he put a little zero up there, and he says, what is that? And I says, 3 degrees above zero, below zero, yeah. I just want to give you a little bit about my background here. I have a Bachelor of Science in Systems Engineering, I have a Master's in Electrical Engineering, and I have a Master's in Pastoral Ministry. More degrees than a thermometer, right? But just to let you know that I'm not unfamiliar with the topic I'm talking about. I worked 15 years in a research lab, the Air Force Research Laboratory. I worked alongside scientists and various things. And so what I'm going to share with you are things that I have learned and that have helped me to maintain my faith in the age of evolutionism. So why don't we just get started this evening or afternoon? And we're going to start with an agenda. Here's what we're going to talk about, just 3 things. 1, why does it matter what you think about science in the age of evolutionism? Second, we're going to talk about the 4 things that you need to know. 4 things that you need to know in the age of evolutionism about science. And then the 1 thing you need to do. Pretty simple, isn't it? Why does it matter? The 4 things you need to know, the 1 thing you need to do. And I hope that you all will be blessed because of having been here today. So let's start right off. Why does it matter? Okay, number 1, the reason it matters is because most people don't understand science. Most people living today have no idea really of what happens in science today. And here's what I mean by that. You imagine that this is the average person, say some young person, and those young people are not actually working in the practice of science. They don't go to the conferences where they discuss the problems in science. They're not reading the journals that scientists in their particular field are writing. They're totally disconnected from science. They're not actually right there understanding science where it's being practiced today in the 21st century. So really, how do people understand science? Well, first of all, they understand science through technology. You know, a cell phone that you have represents old science that an engineer has taken and applied technology to and created a product that can make progress, right? Technology is progress. And when people see this, they think, okay, that's science. But you know, that's not science. That's old science that engineers have made into a product. Another way that people understand science is through the movies. You can imagine how that is. You know, people understand science through the movies. They understand science through the television shows that they watch and the news media. They filter what you understand as science. They hear about science through their schools. And you go into the science classroom and they do an experiment. But again, that's not science today. That's science of yesterday. They're learning things, you know, if you learn, like in calculus, if you learn L'Hopital's rule, that's 200 or 300 years old. So when you are actually, all these different methods, and of course the last one is the media itself, just all the magazines and things. And so when people understand science, they actually don't go where they're practicing science. They don't understand science. They get through all these different media. They get some idea of what science is. And so what we want to do is we want to get past all that and go right to the heart. Second thing, The reason you need to understand science in the age of evolutionism is that science is not value neutral. You know, it used to be believed, 100 years ago or so, that what scientists believed, the theories that they gave to people, were value neutral. They had no impact on the society at all. We now know that's completely wrong. Just to give you an example, when you think about social Darwinism, which arose just 30 years after Darwin wrote his theories, social Darwinism essentially is if you can think about the modern 1% and the 99% that you've been hearing about in the news, you know, the 1%, which would be the global ruling elite, they would be the ones who have the money and the power. Well, in social Darwinism, they're the highest evolved. And of course, the 99% are the lower evolved. That means everyone in this room is probably the lower evolved to these people. And that's what social Darwinism is. You climb up on top of everyone else to get on top, and that means you're more evolved. That's what it was from the very beginning, and it's what it is today. And so there are societal problems with this. One of the applications of social Darwinism is something called eugenics. And eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. In other words, these guys, the 1% up here, the global elite, if you will, that believe themselves to be higher evolved, will actually use evolution, or they'll use the idea of survival of the fittest, and I can dominate you, and they'll use that to justify doing horrible things. Seriously, that's what eugenics is. Eugenics began in the United States by sterilizing people that they didn't like. Experimenting on black people. That was the Tuskegee experiments. Eugenics today is called Planned Parenthood. It's abortion on demand. It's the elimination of humanity. You know, I'm going to read you one thing quickly from Dr. Henry Morris about the values that have come from the theory of evolution. He writes this. He says, "Untold damage has been wrought, especially during the past century, by this dismal doctrine that man is merely an evolved animal. Racism, economic imperialism, communism, Nazism, sexual promiscuity and perversions, aggressive militarism, infanticide, genocide, and all sorts of evils have been vigorously promoted by one group or another on the grounds that since they were based on evolution, they were scientific and therefore bound to prove beneficial in the long run." Think about that. You know, science, what scientists tell you is not value neutral. It has an impact on society. You know, when you think about the current government, this man, John P. Holdren, is the science advisor for our current president. He's a eugenicist. He's a social Darwinist. And here's the book that he has. It's talking about how we need to get rid of people. That's eugenics. Or just recently, David Attenborough, another one of these fellows, says humans are a plague on the earth. It's time to get rid of the 99% so that the 1% can have a good old time. You see, this is why you need to understand science in the age of evolution. Science is not value neutral, and young people need to know this. And then number 3, the third thing that reason you need to understand science in the age of evolution is the word authority. You know, one of the things about science is young people will go into the science classroom or they'll hear a lecture and they'll be discussing science of yesteryear, and that because they can do an experiment and see that it works, they think that science is an authority. They make it an authority in their life. Well, there's a problem with that. You see, the word authority, according to Merriam-Webster, means the power to influence or command thought, opinion, or behavior. And so if you allow science to become an authority in your life, it will be what controls your thoughts, your behaviors, and your actions. This is why you need to understand science in the age of evolutionism, because it should not be an authority in your life. In fact, this doctor right here, Dr. Alvin Plantinga, he's a professor of analytic philosophy. He writes in a book Where the Conflict Really Lies the following, and I found it very interesting. He says, first, science doesn't address some of the topics where we most need enlightenment. Religion, politics, and morals, for example. It doesn't address them at all. Many look to scientists for guidance on matters which scientists have no special expertise. They apparently think of scientists as a new priestly class. Unsurprisingly, scientists don't ordinarily discourage this tendency. But of course, the scientist pontificating on matters outside her field is no better than anyone else pontificating on matters outside her field. Second, science contradicts itself, both over time and at the same time. Two of the most important and overarching contemporary scientific theories are general relativity and quantum mechanics. Both are highly confirmed and enormously impressive. Unfortunately, they can't both be correct. You see, and this is the issue. You know, friends, one of the things that I learned, just like this man here, Dr. Robert Youngston, in a book called Scientific Blunders, A Brief History of How Wrong Scientists Can Be, he writes that attitudes to science are determined almost entirely by how much people know about it. And friends, this is why I want to share with you this seminar. Because the four things that I'd like to teach to you today, the one thing that you need to do, those were the things that helped me so that science would not become an authority in my life, so that I would be able to keep my faith in the age of evolutionism. And so, let's go. Let's take a look. I would like for you to have a new attitude towards science as we discover these four things. Now, you ready? You write this down. Here's number one. We're going to go to the agenda. We're going to look at the four things you need to know. Here it is. Number one. First thing you need to know about science is not the what?
Truth.
Yeah, science is not the truth. And I'll explain what I mean by that. In fact, instead of me explaining it, let's go to a professor of science. I'll let the first word come from Dr. Arthur Stradler of Columbia University. He writes in a book, Understanding Science, he says this: I suggest that in our search for insight into the nature of science, we set some strict limits to how we use the words fact, actuality, and truth. Let us vow never again to say, scientists discover the truth. Observation statements, that's like theories, that are the building block of science and all knowledge within the research fields, are designed only to minimize the probability of failing to make a true statement. Let us admit that the human mind or brain will never be privy to the truth in science. And so, friends, science is not the truth. And I want to explain why that is. Let's check it out here for a minute. Science itself comes from the Latin word scientia. And scientia means knowledge. What science basically is, I have a definition here, is science is a systematic enterprise of gathering knowledge about the world and organizing and condensing that knowledge into testable laws and theories. And so what we know that science is that science is a human method of gathering knowledge. And that's important to understand. Because when you understand that science is not the truth, it's about us gathering knowledge, then that opens up your mind to what science is really all about. You see, Dr. Peter Godfrey Smith, he's a professor of the philosophy of science. He writes in a book, Theory and Reality. He says there is still a great deal of disagreement about even the most basic questions concerning the nature and status of scientific knowledge. You see, science is about gathering knowledge, but there's a problem here with knowledge, and I'd like to explain what it is. It's a problem that is as old as science itself. This professor right here, Dr. Stephen L. Goldman, explains what it is from Lehigh University in a lecture he gives called Science Wars, What Scientists Know and How They Know It, when he says this. He talks about the philosopher Plato, who lived 2,400 years ago, and the philosopher Plato was a man seriously concerned about knowledge. And the same problem that he brings up in this dialogue called the Sophist is the problem that we have today with science and knowledge. And here's what it is. You know, Plato believed that knowledge, he had these two groups in this little dialogue called the Sophists. The first group here was the heavenly dwellers, and the heavenly dwellers were the philosophers like Plato. You know, he put himself up there in the stars, didn't he? He was a heavenly dweller. And what he believed was knowledge was this. He said that knowledge is that which one can't be wrong. So if you have knowledge, it's got to be right. It's got to be universal and timeless and necessary. It's all those things, right? But that's not quite the case. The Sophists, on the other hand, the other group that he was against in this, the earth dwellers, obviously they're lesser than he is, they believe knowledge another way. They believe that knowledge is linked with experience and real-life decisions. In other words, the gathering of knowledge is going to be dependent upon your beliefs, your cultural situation, your particular concept, the kind of assumptions that you make when you gather that knowledge. And so for them, knowledge is probable. Well, guess what, friends? The people who are in the philosophy of science have studied this over the years, and they've come to the conclusion that everybody always thinks that what they believe is knowledge is the absolute truth, but the reality is it isn't. The knowledge that we have in science is really more like this. It's always based upon assumptions. It's always probable. It's always based within a context. And so this is what's going on in science today, and I'd like to explain why that is. Dr. Ferdinando Cananelli is a professor in philosophy and hermeneutics, which means interpretation. And he writes that the act of knowledge, the act of gathering anything in knowledge, is always a subject-object relationship. And I'll explain what I mean by that. In the classical model, you have an object and a subject. Let's say I'm the subject and you're the object. And I'm going to get some knowledge about you, right? Well, in the process of doing that, there's a relationship. The subject is gathering information, and then the knowledge, basically, that comes out of that relationship doesn't come directly from the object that you're studying. Now, in Plato, the heavenly dweller Plato, for him, saying that knowledge is something you can't be wrong about, it's absolutely true and it's timeless, for him the knowledge comes directly out of the object. But we know that's not the case. We know that knowledge always, there's a relationship between the one gathering the knowledge and the knowledge that we gather, that we call science, is always a mixture of the two. I'll give you an example. Let's say that this is called descriptive science. And in descriptive science, you have an object you're studying, say the leaf, and there you are, you're the subject, and here's the relationship. And what you're going to be doing in this study then is you're going to be categorizing what you see. What size is it? How big is it? What's the texture? What's the weight? And in this, but let me ask you a question. If it's in this kind of science, this kind of knowledge, is it like Plato where it's the absolute truth, timeless truth, or is it still probable and conditional? Which one would you say? Any guesses?
Probable.
Thank you, it is. It's still probable. You know why? Because if I study this leaf with a magnifying glass, right, I can learn so many things about it. But if I apply an electron microscope, I can learn infinitely more. And so the limit on the knowledge that you can gather from descriptive science is always the technology that you use to gather that knowledge. And so we can honestly say that we will never reach that place where we know all there is to know about an object, because our technology will change over time and what we can know will change. And so you will never know everything there is to know about what you're studying. Now, another type of science that we have, what I call normal science, and this is what it is. This is normally how science is done, works like this. Again, you have the object you're studying, you have the subject, you have this relationship, and the knowledge that comes out of this relationship is a combination of the observations that you make on the object and your experiences, your worldviews, and your paradigms. You see, in normal science, when they're gathering this knowledge, what happens is they include their beliefs, their worldviews, their knowledge, their experience, and that is mixed with the study of the object, and the knowledge that we gather, that we call science, is always a combination of these things. And it's so important that you understand that. You see, because science is not the truth. It's a gathering of knowledge. And that knowledge, the truth of the subject, is never ever reached. Let me give you some examples of how that might work. Imagine for a moment that you would have this object, we're both studying it, here's a scientist and there's a scientist, and they have different beliefs about how that object works or it should work. What's going to happen? You're going to have, as they study it, you're going to have two different reports, and those reports are not going to be the same. And this is exactly how it works in science today. And of course, the limit on this is technology that you can use to study this object and your beliefs. And so beliefs or paradigms are just as integral to science today as anything else. And this is why I say that science is not the truth. Let me give you an example of how science works and how its study of knowledge changes over time. Let's imagine for a moment that we are wanting to understand the sun, moon, and stars and how they operate. And so we're scientists, we want to know how this works. Well, that happened a long time ago. There was a guy named Aristotle, and he was up there studying the stars and wondering how things worked. And he believed that, in his theory, his paradigm was that the earth was at the center of the universe. And everything revolved around the earth. That was one of his paradigms. The second one of his paradigms was that when the planets move, they always move in circles like this. Okay, so he had two paradigms. Well, guess what? Those paradigms became popular. And over time, about 150 years after Christ, there was a guy named Ptolemy, and he followed Aristotle's theory, and he, using better mathematics, he started making predictions. Maybe we can predict when things are going to happen. And sometimes they worked, and sometimes they didn't. He had a system where he placed the sun right here. So here's the earth, and then there's the sun. And you'll notice these little circular orbits like this. That's exactly how the paradigm that Aristotle had. And this was the system. Now notice, everyone who was a scientist living in those days followed this system, believed that it was the absolute truth, like the heavenly dwellers, like Plato, the heavenly dwellers. This is a universal, timeless truth. It's necessary. But watch what happened. We go through time, and all of a sudden, several centuries later, this guy shows up, Copernicus, and he says, I don't think that's quite right. I believe that the sun is at the center, not the earth. And so Copernicus gave us a new paradigm. But it's funny, his predictions were not any better than Aristotle's, and the reason was because he kept the same paradigm that Aristotle had, that the planets go in these weird circular orbits. It wasn't until we got to the days of this guy, Kepler, he followed Copernicus's paradigm, and he has a new paradigm that planets don't do that they just go in simple ellipses. And now we have arrived at a time where we understand a little more about our universe that we live in. It's more accurate. But guess what, friends? In every single step, we weren't just building on the past knowledge here, because in every single step, the paradigms that were held to be true, they thought were undeniable truths. But the reality was they were conditional. They were based upon the beliefs or the assumptions of those scientists that studied them. And so those paradigms can change. I'll give you another example. Let's just think about the continents that we have on our world today. Last century, there was a guy named Alfred Wenger. Alfred Wenger, at the time when he was living, he was a geologist, and he believed, at the time he lived, the paradigm was that continents were fixed and they didn't move. Continents never moved. And that was believed to be a timeless truth. It was the absolute truth. They never moved. But Alfred Wenger came on the scene, and he sort of noticed how this coast of Africa kind of looked like a key to South America, and he began to wonder, and he proselytized that, I think that the continents are moving. Do you realize that all during his life, they rejected him? They even said, he said, you can't even play as a geologist because you don't believe this timeless truth that I believe, and that's that continents don't move. Listen to what Dr. Ariel Roth writes. He says, before acceptance, you are not part of the geological community if you believe that continents shifted. Afterwards, by the way, this is after he died, they shifted their beliefs. Afterwards, to believe that they did not slide across the surface of the earth made you a geological outcast. You getting what I'm saying? Science is not the truth. You see, there's this battle going on about the knowledge in science. There's this group that has this paradigm, and they believe their paradigm is the absolute truth. But the reality is, their paradigm was always based upon assumptions. It was based upon their beliefs, their context. And so those paradigms are likely to change over time. Expect it to happen. Just think about how this worked. When the paradigm was Aristotle, it was basically, we were pretty far away from the absolute truth of the object. But when we had the paradigm change with Kepler, we started getting closer. But we're never going to make it. You are the absolute truth. If a scientist was studying you, he would never know everything he could know. See, that's the whole idea. The truth is the object itself. Science tries through gathering knowledge to understand it, but it never gets to the place where it can say that it is the absolute truth. And that's how it works. But you know, friends, you could also have a paradigm change, and science would go further and further and further away from the actual truth of the matter, couldn't you? And I believe we have in the past, and I'll share that with you today. And so, friends, science is not the truth. Science is a human endeavor. The absolute truth regarding the study of the object is never reached, ever. Okay, so that's the first thing you know. If you can understand that science is not the truth, you have it. Let me help you fill out these sheets for a second here. But let's look at part 2 and number 1, science is not the truth. So write down, science is not the truth. The first bullet says, science is a systematic enterprise of gathering knowledge about the world and organizing and condensing it into testable laws and theories. The second bullet, there are limits in what you can know in science, limits due to the technology, put that down. And secondly, beliefs or paradigms held by the scientists in the field, and that's a fact. And so science is not the truth. Science is always limited in what it can know because it's simply a system of humans trying to determine what is true, what is knowledge, gathering knowledge about something in the world. All right, number 2. The second thing you need to know about science in the age of evolutionism is this. Oh, I want to stop here for a moment. How many of you know young people? Yeah. Oh, thank you. I want to share with you that if you have children or grandchildren or friends who are younger, what they're being taught today is to put science on a pedestal. And what I want to share with you is that we need to be sharing with them that if you put science on a pedestal, you have to have a cautionary statement here. Science as truth is subject to change without notice. Because science is, all the scientists believe that everything that they believe is the absolute truth, timeless, necessary truth. But the reality is, it's not. It's subject to change without notice. We just saw 2 examples of that. And when you think about Christians, where should they go to base truth in their lives? Jesus said in Matthew 6:24-27, he said that everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. I believe that today young people need to understand that they need to build their lives on the rock. The rock is found in Christ. It's His Word. And then he says, because when the winds blow and the floods come, then the house that you build on that rock will stand. But if you build your house on science, thinking that science is the truth that's going to guide your life, friends, you're building your house on sand. Because it will shift as the winds and the tides of humanity change. Trust me on that. The Bible itself, it says in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, all Scripture is breathed out by God. It's profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be competent and equipped for every good work. I believe that this is where you need to build your life. That's where you need to have your foundation. Science will never be able to provide that for you. All right, number 2. Science is like the circus. I want you to think about this for a minute. Science is like the circus, and here's why I say that. The circus is neat. I believe everyone in here has probably seen the circus at one time or another when it came into town. The circus comes into town, they roll in and they put up their great big tent, and there in the tent is the circus ring, and in the circus ring you have all the performers. You have the lion act, you have the elephants and the clowns, you have the trapeze artists, and then there is this person called the ringleader. Do you realize that in the circus, the ringleader is the king? Look here. He's got a crown right here on his hat. He's got a big crown right there on his chest. In the circus, the ringleader is the king. Because the ringleader is the one that can control who gets to play in the circus ring. It's the one that gives the credibility to the act. It determines whether it is a circus act or not a circus act. The ringleader is the king. Okay? Now that you know that, science is like the circus. You see, there are so many different fields in science today. They're from plasmas physics to thermodynamics, engineering, sociology, just all kinds of weird things. And all of them play in the big circus ring of science. But guess what? Science also has a ringleader. And you know who the ringleader is in science? The ringleader in the big circus tent of science is this thing called a paradigm. The ringleader in the circus tent of science is the paradigm. Now let me share with you what a paradigm is. A paradigm is an assumption or a presupposition or a belief about how something should be or act. Did you see that? Could be an educated guess. But a paradigm is a presupposition. It's a belief, okay, held by someone about how something should be or something should act. An example of a paradigm is a hypothesis or a theory. Those are often paradigms. But here's the important point. According to Dr. Thomas Kuhn, we're going to hear a few words from this man. He's a professor in the philosophy of science. He's got degrees in not only physics, but he's got them in other fields. He wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. We're going to be studying a lot from this guy's writings because he became known in the field of the philosophy of science as a man who really revealed the social nature of science and how science works. And so we're going to learn a little bit about him. And he talks a lot about paradigms in science. He says that paradigms are a sign of maturity in a given field, that they are seen as more successful than competing paradigms in solving problems that a specific group of scientists finds important. He says that they commit scientists to the same rules and standards. And here's the important point here. They're inflexible. They restrict theories outside what the paradigm supplies. And this is why I said that paradigms are like the ringleader in science, because the paradigm, if you have a paradigm in science that they accept in science today, it is inflexible. Anything that's competing with it, that's outside of that paradigm, ooh, you're out, man. You can't play, because it contradicts the paradigm that they have in science. And I want you to think about the importance of this. The paradigm in science is the ringleader in the big circus tent of science. Now, write this down. The paradigm in power determines what is considered scientific. Because the paradigm is the ringleader in the big circus tent of science, it will control what is considered to be scientific and what is not considered to be scientific. I'll give you an example of that. We have this theory called the theory of evolution, Darwinism. And one of the reasons why an atheist like Richard Dawkins can go around the country and stand on the television shows and go, I am a scientist and evolution is scientific, but intelligent design is not scientific, and I have got all the science. The reason that he can do that is because the paradigm that is in control right now in science is the paradigm of Darwinian evolution. Of course, that's just in America, by the way. In Europe, they've already chucked Darwin out the door. But in America, the paradigm is Darwinian evolution. So he can stand up there and say, I am the scientist and you're not, because I believe in Darwinian evolution. But the thing they're not telling you is this. That's only because that's the paradigm that's in control right now in science. By the way, I've always found this picture interesting, haven't you? You've got this guy here that kind of looks like somebody today. And then you've got these monkeys back here that look just like the monkeys we have today. And right here in the middle you have all these illusions. Isn't that interesting? Well, why did these guys evolve? The same guys we have today, same guys we have today. Oh, right here, imagination. It's really kind of. I believe personally that Darwinism is the science of evolution works on your imagination more than it does in the real scientific world, because you can't actually do experimentations to prove any of this, and it's not in the fossil record. But anyway, let's go on. There are a lot of scientists today who are not Darwinists. There are a lot of scientists today who completely do not agree with this paradigm. Problem is, they're not really likely to stand up and shout about it. Why? This guy will tell you why. Professor C.P. Martin is from McGill University. He's an anti-Darwinist, and he actually stood up and he said this. And he was asked a question. Why are there so few of you guys standing up like that? He says, well, as to our fewness, it must be remembered that unless we command independent means of publication, it's very difficult to obtain a hearing today. You see, because the paradigm in power is Darwinian evolution, remember, a paradigm does not allow any other competing theories to be shown. So here you have a competing theory. What are they going to do? They're going to shun you. It's just like kids that wear the wrong kind of clothes. You know, when they go to school, they're the out kids. They're kind of shunned by the big group because they're wearing the wrong clothes. It's exactly how it works in science. The paradigm in power is everything. That's how it works. You know, and I want to share with you the paradigm that sparked the age of evolution. Do you know that that Darwinism wasn't the paradigm that sparked evolution? The paradigm that sparked evolution happened before that. And it was a paradigm called naturalistic philosophy. Naturalistic philosophy. And I want to be clear here that, you know, how many of you ever heard the word naturalist or something like that? Yeah, we all have heard that before. I don't want us to be confused, because there's two uses of the word naturalism, okay? And I'm going to explain the two of them to you so that you'll understand this. There is something called methodological naturalism, and then there is naturalistic philosophy. And I'm going to explain the difference between the two so you'll have this down and you'll understand it. Methodological naturalism is simply the practice of doing science without invoking an outside cause to stop the conversation, to stop the discussion, okay? It's a way of doing science that uses the natural laws that we've discovered, like physics and chemistry, and testable consequences, like experimentation. So methodological naturalism is simply doing science without, if you don't understand something that you're observing, you don't stop and say, I gotta pull an outside cause to explain this. I'll give you an example of what I mean by an outside cause. You ready? One of the greatest examples in history of pulling an outside cause to stop the discussion is what I call Darwin's leftovers. Evolution's leftovers. You know, the human appendix. You know, they used to tell us that the human appendix was a leftover from your evolution, right? Well, we can stop studying the human appendix right now. It's a leftover from evolution. Because they didn't understand it. Well, we now know today it's got something to do with our immune system, right? Or they used to say the last bone in your spine, you've got one, was a leftover from your tail when you were a monkey. No, seriously, they did say this. And of course, obviously, we know today, if you read an anatomy book, that there are muscles attached back there. But the one today that's probably the most interesting is this idea that scientists who don't understand everything that's happening in the DNA that they're studying, they're evoking the fact that it's junk DNA left over from your evolution. You see, all of those things are examples of evoking an outside cause to try to stop the discussion. And that's not methodological naturalism. That's not the way science is done, okay? Just to give you an idea of what it might be like. And so, let me share with you that even atheists know that people who are Bible-believing Christians and that are believers can practice science. And let me explain. This is from an encyclopedia called the New Encyclopedia of Unbelief. It's an encyclopedia for atheists. It says here, science and religion are not necessarily at loggerheads, and the results of scientific inquiry do not necessarily controvert religious belief. Nevertheless, there are clear tensions between scientific and religious knowledge systems. Scientists employ methodological naturalism, the normative concept that scientific investigations use only natural law and its consequences and deal only with objects or claims that have testable consequences in the natural world. Methodological naturalism is different from philosophic naturalism, that's naturalistic philosophy, the ontological conviction that nothing exists beyond natural law and effect. While scientists are necessarily methodological naturalists, they are not necessarily philosophical naturalists and therefore not necessarily unbelievers. Now the important point here is this. They go on to write on page 687 and 88 of the same encyclopedia, there is nothing contradictory about practicing methodological naturalism and belief in a creator God. Did you catch that? However, philosophic naturalism, which is based in religious atheism, precludes belief in a creator. Okay. So now you know, when you hear the word naturalism, you've got to think in your mind, what are they talking about here? Most of the time, they're talking about naturalistic philosophy. And naturalistic philosophy is atheism. It is religious atheism. This is an important point. Naturalistic philosophy is atheism. And what did I say that naturalistic philosophy was today in science? It is the paradigm that is ruling in science today. The paradigm, or the belief, or the worldview that sparked the age of evolution is this paradigm. It's this philosophy called naturalistic philosophy that is essentially atheism. Now, how do you apply naturalistic philosophy in the world today? Well, here's how it works. There's a daughter that comes out of naturalistic philosophy. It's a theory called materialism. Materialism. And what materialism is it's a scientific theory that applies naturalistic philosophy to produce explanations that atheists and secular humanists agree with. That's my definition, but I'm going to share with you, I think it's very correct. That's essentially what's happening today. Naturalistic philosophy and the sister materialism is the two predominant paradigms in science today. Let me give you an example. How many of you ever seen Time magazine? Did you happen to get this episode? This episode, you got Time magazine here, and on the cover you got someone praying, and there's a picture of their DNA, and it says, the God gene. Does our DNA compel us to seek a higher power? Believe it or not, some scientists says yes. See, this is first of all, this is the paradigm of naturalistic philosophy, which is atheism. This is a materialistic explanation. So for them, what they do is they claim that your DNA, you are a mechanism. You know what a mechanism is? You're a machine. Your DNA forces your behavior. I am here today. I am a believer. I am forced to pray to God. You know, this is exactly how they see you. I'm not kidding you. This is how they see you. You know, to the atheists, they believe the materialistic explanation is that you're not a believer because God is real, or that because Jesus Christ is real, or that you have accepted this salvation and you have this Holy Spirit in you. They don't believe that. You're just a mechanism to you. See, you're just a materialist explanation. Are you getting this? This is exactly how it works. I'll give you another one. You know, for a Christian who believes in the Ten Commandments, you know, rape would be a moral evil, wouldn't it?
Amen.
Wouldn't it?
Yes.
You'd be breaking that 10th commandment for sure, wouldn't you?
Amen.
Thou shalt not covet. Well, what does the atheist community do with that? Well, here's what they do. Here's another example of a materialistic explanation that comes from naturalistic philosophy. This is from a paper called The Natural History of Rape that was published by Cambridge MIT Press in 2000, where the authors say that rape is an evolutionary adaptation that permits men unsuccessful in marriage to propagate their genes. Are you getting this? You see, the paradigm is the ringleader in science. The paradigm determines what is science and what is not. The paradigm controls everything today in science. And the paradigm in science today is naturalistic philosophy. That's what gave us, you see, you know, that's what gave us the rise of evolution. Let's go ahead and fill out your study sheet here on number 2. Science is like the circus. Okay. The ringleader, write that down, in science is the paradigm. Number 2, a paradigm is an assumption or belief about how something should be or act. Number 3, the paradigm in power determines what is considered scientific. What is considered scientific? Number 4, the paradigm that brought us the age of evolutionism is naturalistic philosophy and the application of it through the theory of materialism. All right, 2 more to go. So you've got the first one. Science is not the truth. The second one, science is like the circus. And the paradigm is the ringleader. All right, number 3. You ready for number 3? Number 3, science is about power. Science is about power. You know, there were 5 people standing around talking, and 2 of them had disagreed on something very important. And so the first man expressed his opinion about why something was true the way he saw it. And as he eloquently told it all, one of the men stood back and said, "You're right." Then a second man had a different opinion. He stood up and he gave an eloquent explanation of why his way was correct. And again, the same man looked at him and said, "You're right." So the lady that was watching all this looked at him and said, "Wait a minute, they can't both be right." And he said, "You're right." I'm going to ask you a question. Who's right when paradigms are competing? Who's right in science today when you have one paradigm that says one thing and another paradigm that says another? Who's right when they're competing? I'd like to share that with you as we study for a second here. According to Dr. Thomas Kuhn, he tells us that when paradigms change, the one that is right is the one who has power. Now remember, this is a PhD doctor. This is one of the most respected guys in the philosophy of science. He wrote this book. When paradigms change, the paradigm that is considered correct is the one that gets power. How would you like to see that happen in real time? And actually experience that with me for a moment. The competing of 2 paradigms. You know, he writes in his book that the change of paradigms is like a revolution. Listen to what he says. Scientific revolutions are like political revolutions that aim to change political institutions in ways that those institutions themselves prohibit. Their success, therefore, necessitates the partial relinquishment of one set of institutions in favor of another. In other words, he's talking about going from like democracy to communism, or from a monarchy to a democracy. I mean, that kind of revolution is what he's talking about. That's how it happens in science. When you go from one paradigm to another, it's a revolution that happens. How would you like to see a modern example of that? Are you ready? Okay. Well, I got a caution sign up here. Before I go any further, I want to warn you that because this is a current event, it's happening in your lifetime, you might get emotional about what I'm going to share. I want to share with you that I'm not here in any way to pick sides, and I'm not promoting one side over the other. So don't shoot me, but I want to share with you both sides so that you'll see exactly how it works in science today. Are you ready? Here we go. All right, having said that, 20 years ago, a new paradigm happened in science. The United Nations had a scientific group that started a committee. It was called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what they did was they began to had a new paradigm, and here's the paradigm, that man-made CO2 from driving your cars and from manufacturing and various different things was causing the planet to heat up, like the greenhouse. And if nothing happens, if we don't stop the rise in carbon, then what's going to happen is the planet is going to overheat and we're going to have catastrophe. We're all going to die. Okay? Well, here's what it says. Global warming. Human-produced CO2 that comes from manufacturing, from driving cars, trucks, and creating electricity is directly responsible for the heating of the planet And if this increase in CO2 is not stopped, the planet will overheat, resulting in damage and destruction. That's what global warming was all about. New paradigm. Well, okay. There was a scientist named Dr. Ralph B. Alexander, and Dr. Alexander writes in this book here, Global Warming False Alarm, the Bad Science Behind the United Nations Assertion that Man-Made CO2 Causes Global Warming. He writes this. Now, I want you to look at this. These are the both sides, right? I'm going to show both sides. He says this, quote, contrary to popular opinion, however, the major greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is not CO2, but water vapor, H2O. Water vapor accounts for about 70% of the Earth's natural greenhouse effect, and water droplets in the clouds another 20%, while CO2 contributes only a small percentage, between 4 and 8% of the total. So what this man is saying is that the Earth naturally has to be heated. If we didn't have heat, we'd die. And the natural heating of our Earth doesn't happen from CO2, it happens from water in one form or another. 90% of the heating of our planet happens from water. And only 4 to 8 would be contributable to CO2. So, he writes in his book that the global warming debate hinges on this issue of how the separate observations about the Earth's temperature and the CO2 content in the atmosphere should be interpreted. So that's the debate right now. How do you interpret CO2 temperature, CO2 in the atmosphere versus the temperature of the Earth? That's the whole thing. Well, in his book, he looks at the methodology of the IPCC, the United Nations group. Here's what he says. He says the IPCC has been seen as inflating the data that the Earth is heating up by cherry-picking data from areas that are naturally warmer and excluding data from areas that are naturally colder. He also writes, the IPCC has made up data. You know, made up data. You hearing that? Cheated on the exam. Made up data. IPCC has made up data that it uses to convince governments that CO2 is linked to warmer temperatures. This is the famous hockey stick graph that is now discredited. That was several years ago. They showed this picture, had a hockey stick graph. Oh, look, it's going straight up. It was all fake. It was made up data. Okay, number 3. The IPCC ignores data that shows that temperatures in the distant past have gone down even when the CO2 level in the atmosphere is higher. Okay? So having said all this stuff, looked at all this data, then we can look at some of these news articles that are coming out. These are all last year. They're towards the end of last year. I just picked them up off the internet. Here's one, global warming stopped 16 years ago, reveals Met Office, reported quietly released, and here's the chart to prove it. You know, you could go online and get this. Here's another one. Does NASA data show that global warming was lost in space? Apparently, NASA had some satellites in space, and they did a study of the heat of the planet. And here's what they found. This was the guy, Dr. Roy Spencer. He was the team leader of the Advanced Microwave Scanning Radiometer. That was the satellite, the sensor that was in space. They were looking at the Earth. They were looking at heating and warming. And here's what they said. The satellite observations suggest there is much more energy lost to space during and after warming than the climate models show. He said the planet isn't heating up, in other words. In a greenhouse, you can close all the windows and get hot, right? But what he's saying here is that the Earth's kind of like a greenhouse that has windows. If it gets hot, it just opens a window. The heat escapes. Well, now we've heard all this stuff, right? You got the United Nations view that man-made global warming is causing this catastrophe, and as a result, we've got to have higher gas prices, we've got to have higher taxes, we got a carbon tax, we've got to have all this stuff to suppress the people so that they can't produce, they can't consume, so that we can save the planet, right? Then you've got all this information that these scientists say, wait, this is totally not right. Okay, so, you've got more. World Atlas, ice loss claim exaggerated. There's an atlas of the world. They're putting it so that there's less ice. They're saying, that's not true. And then, of course, you got this guy, President Obama. I am a firm believer that climate change is real. And I was wondering whether he meant we go from fall to winter and winter to spring. I wasn't quite sure what he was saying there. But he's a politician. All right. So, having shown you this, okay, I've shown you all this, having shown this to you, and now that you know about science a little bit, you know it's not the truth, You know, it's like the circus, and the ringleader is the paradigm. You know the paradigms are competing here. One paradigm says that global warming is not attributable to CO2. The other one says it is totally attributable to CO2. Not only any CO2, but you bad person that breathes. You're the bad person. You drive a car, you're bad. Okay, so according to Dr. Kuhn, which one is right? Which paradigm is the right paradigm? Which one is the correct, the absolute paradigm that we should follow? Which one? According to Dr. Kuhn, which one is right? Okay, I'll give you the answer. You guessed it, the one who has power. The paradigm that has power in the universities, in the government, in the policies that govern society, this guy right here is the paradigm that's got power right now. And you know, there's implications in science when the paradigm shifts. Because remember, this paradigm shifted in your lifetime. It went from a belief that CO2 had nothing to do in climate science to it is now the only thing that matters. And it happened in your lifetime. Well, look what happens. He writes in his book, Dr. Ralph B. Alexander, he writes this. Both groups, now this is the scientists on either side, both groups defend their views vehemently, although the debate, if it can be called a debate, is mostly conducted out of public sight in the silent world of internet blogs. You see that? The average Joe is not hearing this stuff, right? The public visible picture is quite different. Almost exclusively, the mainstream media presents the alarmist view alone, and to do so as if man-made global warming were an established fact, a belief no longer needs to be questioned or debated. This standpoint has even been adopted by many professional scientific societies. Then, he talks about what happens in the scientific community. This guy right here, Dr. Richard Lindzen, he's a professor of atmospheric science at MIT. Pretty extreme, very esteemed individual. He writes this. But there is a more sinister side to this feeding frenzy. Scientists who dissent from the alarmism have seen their grant funds disappear. Their work derided, themselves libeled as industry stooges, scientific hacks, or worse. Consequently, lies about climate change gain credence even when they fly in the face of the science that supposedly is their basis. Now, I'm not showing you this stuff just to teach you global warming. I'm showing you this stuff to teach you science. This is what happens. When you're not in the popular paradigm, you get shunned. Watch. It gets worse. Dr. Kuhn writes this. When, in the development of a natural science, an individual or group first produces a synthesis able to attract most of the next generation's practitioners, read young people today, the older schools gradually disappear. Then he writes this. In part, their disappearance is caused by their members' conversion to the new paradigm. But there are always some men who cling to one or the other older views, and they are simply read out of the profession, which thereafter ignores their work. The new paradigm implies a new and more rigid definition of the field. Those unwilling or unable to accommodate their work must proceed in isolation. Are you catching how science works? Science is about power. The paradigm is the ringleader, and the paradigm in power rules. Okay? This is how it works. Now, how about the textbooks that teach our children? He writes, Thomas Kuhn writes this. He says, science students accept theories on the authority of teacher and text, not because of the evidence. Did you catch that? What alternatives have they, or what competence? The applications given in text are not there as evidence because learning them is part of learning the paradigm at the base of current practice. If applications were set forth as evidence, then the very failure of text to suggest alternative interpretations of that data, or to discuss problems for which scientists have failed to produce paradigm solutions, would convict the authors of extreme bias. This is how science works. Science is about power. Once the paradigm gains power, it gets in the textbooks, and it's not there to teach children unbiasedly. It's very biased. They aren't going to tell you about anything else. Nobody else gets a say because the paradigm is the ringleader in science today. Whatever the paradigm is, that's the power. Science is all about power. Who has it and who doesn't? Okay, so there's our summary. You know, never underestimate the importance of paradigms, friends. Paradigm change happens through a revolution. Winning paradigm is the one that gets power. Let's fill this out. Science is about power, number 3. Number 1 here underneath that. Paradigms in science change as a result of a revolution. And we saw that that's not, it's a political revolution. The winning paradigm is the one that gets power. Okay, number 4. And this is the last one here. I'll let you write it down, okay? Go ahead and write this down. Because the question that we're going to ask is this. What was the paradigm that shifted as we moved into the age of evolutionism? What was the paradigm? Well, write this down in your sheet and then we'll study a little bit. The paradigm change from theism to atheism sparked the age of evolutionism. Let me explain what I mean by that. I'll share it with you again in case you missed it. Dr. Peter Godfrey Smith, in his book Theory and Reality, he writes this. He says, modern science, now this is science that we have basically based on your cell phone, you know, the radio waves and things like that. Modern science is something that descends from specific people and places, especially from a key collection of Europeans, including Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Boyle, and Newton, and many others, all who lived in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, one of the things that all of these people have in common is this. They were all theists. All of them. And I can mention many more, even into the 19th century, like Pascal, germ theory. All these guys were theists. So what happened? Well, let me explain. The paradigm that changed, the old paradigm in science was theism. And under theism, the belief that you have a creator and that things were created, under theism, science was possible because the object they were exploring was part of a design and not chaos. You see, the founders of modern science looked at the world around them and said, you know, it's possible for us to do science because we're not looking at random chaos here, we're looking at design. And that's how we can do science. Well, the shift occurred as we moved into a new paradigm, and the new paradigm is atheism. Through naturalistic philosophy, nothing but nature exists. There is no God. Science is the study. Now, don't miss this part. This is so important right here. Science now is the study of purposeless, random processes. See, the purpose of science is to explain apparent design with chaos. I mean, that's what evolution is. How many of you ever heard of the Darwinian evolution? Okay, you morphed from a single cell to you. All that morphing happened because of natural selection, which is a random chaotic process, random mutation, which is a random chaotic process, and time, and of course time is an illusion. It's an illusion. And so, you know, everything that you have now that relates to who you are with the paradigm of atheism, everything now has to be explained by chaos. And I'll give you some examples of that. But I want to start by sharing with you, when did this happen? When in history was there this little flame that all of a sudden burst and started this off? Well, friends, it happened at a time in history called the French Revolution. You know, the French Revolution was one of the most interesting times in the world, I believe. America was becoming a nation at that time, and there was a revolution happening in France. You had this situation where you had the 1% and the 99%. The 1% was made up of a corrupt clergy, the Roman Catholic Church, and the monarchy. And the 99% was everybody else. And they got to the place where they didn't like that anymore, and they had a revolution. But the ringleaders in the revolution, the Jacobins, were atheists. And as they took over the government, and they established what really was democracy, in a sense, they began to have a council. And the council began to de-Christianize the nation. They changed the number of days of the week. They changed the names of the months. They tore down all the churches. And instead, they put in place of the church this thing called the worship of reason. And I want to explain to you what reason is. When you hear you hear this thing, faith and reason. Have you ever wondered what reason was? I used to think, wait a minute, I'm a reasonable person. What is reason? Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. Because out of the French Revolution came the worship of reason. And I want to explain what it is. And once you understand it, you'll understand this paradigm shift. Imagine for a moment, here's scientific reason. A man walks along, and all of a sudden he sees a tree. It's an apple tree. Oh, wonderful. He picks an apple, he eats it, and he sees inside this apple these little black things. He's not sure what they are, so he doesn't eat them, and he just throws the thing down on the ground. A couple of months later, he comes by, and right where he threw it on the ground, there's a little plant growing. He waits a while, and he comes back, and sure enough, that plant grows. It looked just like the other one, and there's apples on it. Whoa. So he takes one of those apples, and he eats it again. He tears it apart, and he sees those little black things. He says, I bet that little black thing did that. So he runs over, and he digs some dirt, and he plants the little black thing in there. And sure enough, a little plant comes up. He waits long enough, and sure enough, it has those apples on it. And then the man says, I have now discovered a secret that wasn't known before. I have created progress because now I can take these little black seeds. I don't have to go 5 miles to find that apple tree. I can plant it right where I live. And I bet there's other little seeds, and I can plant them. I can control my world. I can create progress. I am God! I'm not exaggerating. That's really basically what it is. Scientific reason is where man says, I figured out how it works, and now I don't need God. I am God. I am God of myself. It's almost like going into the how-to books of nature, opening it up, seeing how nature works, how it works inside, and then shutting the book and saying, I figured this out. I did this. I am like the Most High. I did this. And not one time stopping to think, wait a minute, who designed that thing in the first place?
Yeah.
All right? Scientific reason is an absolute pride of man. If you know your Bible, it's Romans chapter 1. Even though they knew God, they just rejected God. And there's that their foolish hearts were darkened. And they believed the lie. The lie, I think, in this case, is that they are of God themselves. This is the essence of scientific reason. I'll give you an example. Right at the time of the French Revolution, right after it, actually, with Napoleon, there was this guy, Pierre Laplace. He was one of the atheists here, but he was a smart guy. He wrote a multi-volume celestial mechanics book. He showed that Newtonian physics predicted the stability of the solar system. They were worried that perhaps with Newton's physics, that someday the Earth will spiral into the sun. He showed that wouldn't happen. So he was a pretty smart guy. And one day, it's told that he went to dinner at Napoleon's place with some other guys. He was going to be honored. And he had given Napoleon his book. Probably didn't read it. And at the dinner, Napoleon says, so tell me, Monsieur Laplace, what is the place of God in your hypothesis? And Laplace is famously, atheists always like to say this, sire, I have no need for that kind of hypothesis. In other words, I figured it out. I don't need God anymore. God's gone. I now am God. And even philosophers know this. This is George Santayana. He's a contemporary philosopher. He writes in a book, The Story of Philosophy, is written about him. It says, for him, reason is man's imitation of divinity. This is the bottom line, friends. Scientific reason is essentially the practice of claiming that you're God. I don't need God. I figured out what the little seeds are for, so I don't need God anymore. Because I now am God. I can control my world. I can create progress. And that's what's happening. This is what's happening in science. Now, I want you to think about what Dr. Kuhn says here. He says that a paradigm change is like picking up the other end of the stick. A process that involves handling the same bundle of data as before, but placing them in a new system of relations with one another by giving them a different framework. You see, this is the essence of what happens with a paradigm change. The paradigm that shifted as we went from the era of theism and belief in God as a creator to the era of evolution and non-belief is that we went from theism to atheism. And under atheism, you handle the same bundle of data, you just pick it up on the other side, and you give it a brand new framework. You explain it in a different way. And so this is what happened. Not long after the French Revolution, you had a guy named Charles Lyell in the 1840s. He was a lawyer. He turned geologist. He didn't like the fact that geologists of his day were looking at the Grand Canyon and things like that and claiming that this was done by catastrophe. Perhaps a flood. Well, he certainly couldn't have that. He was an atheist. And so what did he do? He came up with a theory of uniformitarianism, a theory that basically replaces any geology that could have been formed by catastrophe with explanations that require long ages, like millions of years. Hello? Same data, new interpretation. Or this guy right here. You know, Charles Darwin in the 1860s, he really was just taking the paradigm of naturalistic philosophy, which is atheism, and he was applying it, and he became an atheist when he wrote his book. He basically just reinterpreted man's place on the earth, stating that humans are simply evolved beasts and nothing more. There is no creator, there's no God. You get it? This is just a reinterpretation of the data that existed. That's what happened when you shift the paradigm. Dr. Thomas Kuhn writes this. He says, though the world does not change with a change of paradigm, the scientist afterward works in a different world. See, though the world didn't change, the scientist works in a world that's totally changed. Just as an example, this man right here is a professor of biological sciences at Cornell University. He writes in his journal, Academy. His name is William B. Provine. He says that religion is compatible with modern evolutionary biology, and indeed all modern science, if the religion is effectively indistinguishable from atheism. Are you getting this? You see, the paradigm that shifted, that brought us into this age of evolutionism, was a paradigm from theism to atheism. And I want to share with you that when they do normal science today, the scientists now are doing science, and the paradigm, the belief, the presupposition that's behind everything that's happening is got to be atheistic. That's just how it works. It's the religion of atheism. And this isn't a good thing. I'll give you an example why that is. One of the puzzles and mysteries we have in our world today is the fine-tuning of the universe. The universe, there are four forces. There's a strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, gravitational force, electromagnetic force. All four of those are so finely tuned, so precisely aligned, that even a percentage off would cause life to not exist. Would cause the formation of matter not even to happen. And so, how would someone who is an atheist explain that? Well, you would have to explain apparent design, obviously something that's so finely, precisely tuned that you'd have to have a watchmaker to make it, gives you an indication that you're looking at design. But for them, you can't do that. You have to explain design with what?
Order.
Chaos. Yeah, you have to have chaos to explain design. And that's exactly what's happened in physics. This fellow right here, his name is Dr. Lee Smolin. He's a physicist, and he's not a Christian. He's an evolutionist. But he has been pretty disgusted with physics. The reason for that is, about 30 years ago, physicists trying to explain this fine-tuning decided to come up with a chaotic theory. And the theory they came up with was something called string theory. His book is called The Trouble with Physics, The Rise of String Theory and the Fall of a Science and What Comes Next. Now, the string theory essentially is like this. Imagine for a moment that you're a scientist and you prosper in your mind that you've got these little tiny mathematical model universes that don't exist. They only exist in his mind, but they're little mathematical universes. There could be 10 or 8 or a zillion of them, you don't know. And inside these little make-believe universes or multiverses, you've got these little make-believe particles that you made up. And by the magic of string breaking and supersymmetry, Just like a slot machine, man. Ka-chink! Ka-blang! Here we are. Here's the world, everything in it. That's essentially what string theory is. It's like a slot machine, you know, with a very improbable slot machine. And so this is what this guy says. For the last 30 years now, this has been the predominant theory. This has been the paradigm in physics of how the universe got here. Listen to what he says. He says, the story I will tell you could be read by some as a tragedy. To put it bluntly, and to give away the punchline, we have failed. We inherited a science, physics, that had been progressing so fast for so long that it had been often taken as the model for how other kinds of science should be done. For more than 2 centuries, until the present period, our understanding of the laws of nature expanded rapidly. But today, despite our best efforts, what we know for certain about these laws is no more than what we knew back in the 1970s. And the reason for that is because of the paradigm of string theory. You know, Dr. Daniel Freehan, he's the University of Chicago, Enrique Fermi Institute, you know, big physicist place. He writes this. He says, string theory cannot give any definitive explanations of existing knowledge of the real world and cannot make any definitive predictions. The reliability of string theory cannot be evaluated, much less established. String theory has no credibility as a candidate theory of physics. Yet, it is the only theory. Why? Because it's the paradigm in power, and it is a paradigm that atheists and secular humanists would agree with, because it explains design with chaos. You know, this guy right here, his name is Dr. Leonard Susskind. He had an interview in 2005 in The New Scientist, and basically the article was about, is string theory in trouble? And listen to what he says, because it's instructive. He says, if for some unforeseen reason the landscape, that's talking about all these multiverses, universes, turns out to be inconsistent, maybe for mathematical reasons, because, you know, after all, they're all made up, or because the degree disagrees with observation, that's probably true, I'm pretty sure that physicists will go on searching for what? Look at this word here. Do you hear that word natural there? Okay, what do we think of when we think of natural? Naturalistic philosophy. Naturalistic philosophy is atheism. We'll go on searching for naturalistic philosophy explanations of the world, but if I have to say this, if that happens, as things now stand, we will be in a very awkward position. Without any explanation of nature's fine-tunings, we will be hard-pressed to answer the ID that's intelligent design. Critics, one might argue that the hope that a mathematically unique solution will emerge is as faith-based as ID. Well, it is faith-based. It surely is. Because atheism is a religion. And so, friends, you know, what I'd like to share with you is that what happened in this world is we went from theism to atheism, and when they shifted that paradigm, friends, I believe that science went further and further and further away from what's really true in our world, what's really factual in our world. But I want to just share with you real briefly before we go on to our last section where atheism leads. Remember, I told you that science is not value neutral. What scientists believe have an impact on our society. The reason there are not very many young people in here today is the impact science has had on their lives. Isn't that right? And every time you have atheism in control, you have paganism. I'll give you an example. Natural selection. Natural selection basically is a random, chaotic process. But yet, they use it to explain design. How can you say that is beautifully designed by a naturalistic philosophy? What you're doing is you're attributing to nature the power of a designer. And anytime you hear somebody do that, what are they doing? They're getting you to go over and bow down and worship nature. And what is paganism? Paganism is nature worship. And so atheism always leads to paganism. Here's a beautiful example of that. In the year 2011, in the fall, BBC World Service had a program on, it's a radio program called Heart and Soul, where the name of the program was Nation of Little Faith. If you ever want to look that up and listen to the whole thing, it's called Nation of Little Faith. And what this guy did was, he was a producer, he went into the country of Estonia. It was a formerly communist-controlled country. Now they'd been outside of communism for a while, and they had been reported as being the most, basically, atheistic country in Europe. And he wanted to find out what was happening. So the first thing he did was he interviewed one of the young people that was still in the faith. And she said she thinks that part of the reason why so few people of her age are interested in Christianity is the legacy of state atheism. Think now, who is promoting atheism today? The state. How are they promoting it? In the schools. What is their tool? Evolution, which is a materialistic explanation that is from the philosophy of naturalism. You getting this? Which goes back to atheism, which is the paradigm that shifted, okay? So just a word of advice here for you guys. Then she says, I think that parents who are against religion raise their children in the same spirit, and it comes from the Soviet times when people couldn't go to the churches, and my mom, for example, had to learn the basics of atheism in school. It wasn't so much against her own thoughts. It was so much against her own thoughts. I think parents who are against churches, their children will grow up in the same spirit. And then he goes on, he says, well, let's go look at the population, the larger part of the population now that are pagan. And one of the things that they did was they threw out all of the basic Christian festivals and went for one that happens in the summer solstice called Midsummer's Eve. It was basically a time to go out into nature and party. And there he found a man that was one of these pagan guys, and he interviewed him. And here's what he said. For you, are there any important beliefs that come from being on a day like today? Yeah, we are like pagan, and our God is sovereign in nature. And you must take time to sit down and listen. See, atheism always leads to paganism, always. And he concludes and says, years of state atheism and a lack of religious education have left their effect on Estonia, left their mark on Estonia. Sure enough. And they're leaving their mark on America, too. They're leaving their mark on your family and your children today. Okay, let's go ahead and fill in our blanks here on number 4, and we'll move on to the last part, and we can go home. It says, so the paradigm that changed was from theism to atheism. That sparked the age of evolutionism. Under the old paradigm, science was possible because the object of study was design, not chaos. Under the new paradigm, the purpose of science becomes explaining apparent design by chaos and random processes. All right. Are you ready for now the one thing you can do? Okay, so we looked at why it matters. We looked at the 4 things you need to know about science in the age of evolutionism. And now we're going to look at the one thing you need to do to keep the faith. What can you do and your family do in the age of evolutionism? Here it is, friends. I'm going to share it with you right here. You need to apply a filter. You need to apply filters to what you hear and see as presented in science. You know, an air filter in a car serves a very important purpose. It allows air to get through to the engine, which needs the air to function. But it prevents all the bad things from clogging up the engine so that it stops working. Am I right? You need air filters in your car because you need the air. Same thing happens in science. You need to you need to see what's happening in science. You need that to flow through into your minds. But you want to try to get rid of all the junk that'll clog up your mind in the wrong way. So let me give you an example. There are 2 kinds of filters that you can apply. And I'm going to talk about them, and that'll be the last thing today. The first is you need to apply a sorting filter. A sorting filter. Science is like ice cream. Okay? It comes in flavors. There's 2 flavors. One flavor is descriptive. We talked about that earlier. Descriptive science is most closely just thought of as the scientific method. And the other flavor that we have in science is called normative. And in normative science, you have all these paradigms. You have these beliefs and these different things that scientists add to the knowledge that they're giving you and calling science. And so you've got these 2 flavors, descriptive and normative. Listen to what Dr. Godfrey Smith says. Now remember, everything that I've shared with you is coming from scientists themselves. See, they know this stuff, and they want each other to be prepared, and I want you to be prepared. Listen to what he says. He says, a distinction that is very important here is the distinction between descriptive and normative theories. And you could use the word paradigm if you wanted. A descriptive theory is an attempt to describe what actually goes on. or what something is like without making value judgments. A normative theory does make value judgments. It talks about what should go on or what things should be like. See, in our modern scientific world, they think that what should go on is that we should be atheists, and what we should be like is that we should be evolved. That's kind of the normative theory. All right, so you've got these two kinds of flavors in science. And then he says this: when assessing general claims about science, it is a good principle to constantly ask. Now, how many times do you ask it? Constantly. So what this scientist is saying is you better not be sleeping. You better be constantly asking, is the claim intended to be descriptive or normative or both? And see, here's the deal. Here you are over here trying to learn about science in the age of evolutionism, and you're not actually up there where the scientists are. You're getting it through all these different methods. You're hearing about science. Let me share with you a fact. You hardly ever get science without the mixture. You always get it with descriptive and normative parts in it. And so if you're not vigilant, you're going to be deceived. Let me give you an example. In fact, if you write this down, write down the magnificence of spider silk. Just write that down. If you put that into a search engine, you'll see this woman come up here. Her name is Cheryl Hayashi, and she's a scientist. And she gave a conference at this thing called Technology, Entertainment, and Design. It's a TED conference. This was February 2012, held at Long Beach, California. And her area of science is the study of spiders. And this is like your final exam, okay? If you learned anything here today, this will be your final exam. Because in her presentation, which is a beautiful presentation, she craftfully mixes normative and descriptive science together. And I want to share with you what happens. She begins her presentation by telling where spiders live and how many of them there are, very descriptive. And then she immediately goes into this. What is that? Why, that's evolutionary's tree of life. Well, there's evolutionaries like, the geologic column and where things are. Now notice something. Where's the data? If this is a spider today, what did a spider look like millions of years ago when it was evolving? Now, I don't want you to miss this. She has no data. There is no data. But it doesn't matter. You know why it doesn't matter? Do you know why a scientist like this can stand up there in front of people and just flash that up there and say evolution and then go on? You know why they can do that? Because it's the paradigm that has power. You don't have to have any data. You don't have to have any proof. In fact, your data can contradict your own theory. For example, the geologic column where fossils are, they don't have innumerable intermediate links in them. They don't exist. That don't matter. It doesn't matter that there's no data here because that's the paradigm that's in power. Are you getting this now? You understanding science in the age of evolutionism? She can throw that up there and say evolution, boom. And then she goes on, very descriptive, talks about the uses of spider silk. Then she goes on and shows a fossil spider. Millions and millions of years ago. Oh, by the way, looks just like a spider today. She didn't have to explain why that is because she doesn't have to. Okay? Then she goes on, really descriptive now. She's talking about the organs that create the spider silk. And then right here at the center of the presentation, this beautiful presentation, suddenly she unveils the genetic code for spider silk. Dun, 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 dun. You were listening to her doing this and it's like, oh, wow. Of course, then she goes right back and throws up the tree of life, evolution's tree of life, and then she concludes her presentation with this amazing statement. Now remember, I talked about how atheism leads to paganism. Don't miss this here. She says, "The next time you see a spider web, please pause and look a little closer. You'll be seeing one of the most high-performance materials known to man." Think about that for a minute. You telling me that a chaotic, random process that has no brain, that can't see ahead, that can't even know what's going on, can create something better than we can create? Oh, great nature, I bow down and worship you. You are much greater than any greater God because you can do this. Now, the reason I share this with you is I think this should be your final exam. Because this is what your children and what your parishioners and everyone else are seeing every single day. I guarantee you that if your child or somebody else was to sit there and watch her, you would just be, I mean, she is witty, she's funny, she's charming, she's so smart, and she's got all that descriptive science in there. And you'd come away and go, wow, maybe that evolution stuff is right. And not one time would you think she didn't one time prove anything about evolution. And she doesn't have to. Because it's the paradigm in power. The paradigm in power rules. All right, the second thing you need. So the first thing you need to do is you've got to make sure that when you're listening to science, you filter it. You've got two filters. There's a descriptive filter. Okay, is this describing something? Or is this normative, where it includes all their weird beliefs, like atheism and paganism and whatever? All right, the second thing you need to do in the age of evolutionism, if you want to keep your faith, is you've got to apply a time delay filter. Now, one of the little degrees that I had up there was Bachelor of Science in Systems Engineering, which is what I took many years ago. And one of the things that I learned is that in systems, you can have an input to your system that can cause your output to go unstable. Input comes in, output, whoa, unstable. An example of that would be like this. A young person hears a media story. The media story makes it sound like evolution is true and we don't need God anymore. It goes into the system that they have, the worldview that they built up from their parents about believing in the Bible. And all of a sudden, what happens? Ah! I don't believe anymore. I don't believe anymore. That's great, because you can have an input to your system that causes you to go unstable. What do you do in engineering to solve that problem? Well, here's what you do. Oh, and by the way, before I go there, let me give you some examples of media stories that do that. You know, from the very beginning of evolution, this was just basically, like 30 years maybe after Darwin, maybe a little bit earlier than that. They came up with this guy called the Pit-Dow Man, this guy right here. That's what they drew. And it was the thing that sparked the rise of atheism and evolution in America. Was the discovery of this guy right here. It was a fossil, intermediate link guy. And of course, then after him was Nebraska Man, Java Man, Lucy, Colehent. There's a deception there. Archaeoraptor, which is this reptile to bird thing. Let me share with you something. Every single one of these was discovered to be not what they claimed it to be. This one right here and this one right here are the most insidious. Because this one was an absolute forgery. Remember how they faked the data to show global warming? They faked this. They took a human skull and an ape jaw, they put them together, and they wouldn't let anyone see the actual pieces. They made molds and they showed the molds. Okay? And that's all it took to change the perceptions of the world that evolution was true. 40 years later, scientists finally got a hold of the real articles, and they said, wait a minute, that's an ape jaw and that's a human skull. 40 years later. This one right here happened a little bit sooner. This one down here was where, in China, China is known for knockoffs. And China knows what the atheists in America really want. And so they presented a fossil that looked like a reptile and a bird together, a missing link. Because they're really hot on that today. They want to find one of those. And so some guy, it ends up at the Tucson auction, and this guy looks at it and says, I know this is important, and he buys it for $80,000 and immediately runs over to National Geographic magazine to get some of their guys to come over, and they hyped it up as being this big missing link. Then the guy in China, who's basically in charge of that kind of work, paleontology and work, he says, wait a minute, did that come from China? Yeah. Can I see it? Yeah. So he sees it and he says, that is a fake. We're knocking off fakes like that. We're trying to stop it. But you've been buying all our fakes. You've been providing a market for all of our fakes. And fortunately, this one didn't take more than like 5 years to discover. But the point is that all of these were fakes. They were all misrepresentations. They weren't real. And so here's what you need to do. So you get this input, media story, and instead of letting that mess up your worldview, do what engineers do. Feed that back through a time delay filter. And I don't know what you're going to need, maybe 20 years, 30 years, 5 years, whatever you want. And you put that filter in and say this to yourself, I am not going to do anything about this story. I'm going to do this. I'm going to let science do its thing. Do you know that there are a lot of honest scientists out there? And the one thing that science does the best is it criticizes itself. If scientists can get a hold of the data and actually look at it, you know what they're going to do? They're going to analyze it. They're going to study it. They're going to look at your assumptions. And pretty soon they're going to say, I'm not thinking that's what you said it was. You know? That's what happened with all those other fakes. So if you would just do this, hear the media story, teach people this. Media story, don't let the worldview bother you. Let science do its thing. Apply a time delay filter. And guess what? I guarantee you're going to go through life a lot happier. And eventually, when you hear, all of a sudden you hear on the news, oh, by the way, that Archaeoraptor thing wasn't quite what they thought it was. You'll go, yeah, thought so. Yeah. Okay. And I'm gonna close with another final exam for you. Okay. This is the final exam. Okay, it's the last one. I know we learned. How many have you learned a lot here today?
Yes.
Let me ask you: was it worth coming?
Yes.
Would it have been worth telling a friend they could have come? How about a young person?
Yes.
Would it have been worth it for a young person to have been here today?
Amen.
Yeah. Well, last summer, July, many of you might know that over in Europe they've got this Large Hadron Collider. It's the largest in the world. It's a proton smasher. And what they do is they have this great big huge, this thing over here you're looking at is a thing designed to create magnetic fields, and they channel protons down this big old long tube, and they bring them together and smash them. And then they have detectors, and they're looking for things that separate. In other words, protons are really small, so if they smash and they turn into different parts, they're looking for new parts, basically, right? You know, besides atoms, you know, the atoms, you have an atom, you have a neutron, proton, electron. Well, now we know there's other things in there too because they've been smashing. Well, they've been looking for this thing called the Higgs boson. And essentially they have these theories. One of them is called inflation. And these theories are really basically like, you know, how does matter exist? You know, how did it come from? And one of them is called the Higgs boson. And in July, they came out and they said, you know, big scientific thing, a lot of press. We think we have discovered the Higgs boson. And what that was basically was they smashed the protons and something came off that had a high enough energy level that they thought, well, maybe that's it. Okay, they were looking for energy and they basically found it. All right. So how did the media react? How do you think the media reacted in the age of evolution? Just as curiosity. Favorably or unfavorably towards Christianity? Why? In the age of, if the paradigm is naturalistic philosophy and that's atheism, well, look what happened. Newsweek article right here. It's the same month. And they have an article, The Godless Particle. Science posits a new story of our creation. And they took this experiment that they got a little piece of data, and this is their interpretation of what happened. Now, wait till you see this. As they went through, at the very end of the article, I just want to share the end of the article, and I want you to think about what we just learned here today. Here they are. This is from Lawrence Krauss, the guy who wrote it. He said, if these bold, some would say arrogant notions derive support from the remarkable results of the Large Hadron Collider. Now, these bold, arrogant notions are not the results of the experiment. They're the interpretation of the results by the atheists. Now here, and they're going to tell what it is here in a minute. They may reinforce two potentially uncomfortable possibilities. First, that many features of our universe, including our existence, may be accidental consequences of conditions associated with the universe's birth. Now, did you hear that word? What word? What was the important word there?
Birth.
No. See, with atheism, you explain design with what? Chaos, right. Okay. Accidental consequences that associated with the universe's birth. And second, two, that creating stuff, that's matter, from no stuff, that's non-existent stuff, right, seems to be no problem at all. I mean, after all, we smashed protons, we got something. Everything we see could have emerged as a purposeless quantum burp, which doesn't exist, in space, or perhaps a quantum burp of space itself, which of course doesn't exist, that's science fiction. Humans, now wait, listen to this. Humans with their remarkable tools and their remarkable brains may have just taken a giant step towards replacing metaphysical speculation, that's God, with empirically verifiable knowledge. The Higgs particle is now arguably more relevant than God. Where'd you hear that? What's that called? It's called reason, right? The worship of reason. Remember now, accidental, that's the first one, so it's got to be chaos. Second one's here. Humans, see, look, those scientists are probably honest guys. They probably discovered something. But you know, I just read, I don't know if it was maybe a month ago, they were scratching their heads saying, well, I don't know if it's exactly what we think it was. Remember I told you to apply a time delay filter? Always do that. But the point here is, the way you're going to see science in the age of evolutionism is you're going to see it two ways. One, you're going to see the chaos. And the second thing you're going to see is you're going to see how humans now are God. We now are God. We have replaced God. We now know what the little seed does, and so we don't need God at all. Right? That's what this is all about. Of course, I really wanted to write this back to them, but I don't know. What do you think? Should I have written to Newsweek with this little text right here? Hebrews 11:3. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. Which is exactly what they're saying is happening, right?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, friends, I hope let's go ahead and finish this so you have this to take home in case you didn't get it. Part 3, you need to filter what you hear and see that is presented as science. Number 1, apply a sorting filter. Ask, is it descriptive or normative? 2, apply a time delay filter and let science do what it does best. Well, friends, I hope that you have enjoyed being here this afternoon as much as I have. I love to teach people about science because I know that once you understand science, you will knock science off the pedestal of your life and you will replace it with God, because you'll understand that science is simply a human endeavor to achieve knowledge, and it's very biased because of these things called paradigms. And once you have a paradigm in power, it's the ringleader. Nobody else gets to play. But I want to share with you, remember we talked about revolutions?
Yeah.
There is a revolution still happening in science. It's called Intelligent Design Community, a Creation Science Community. Those guys are still there and they're very active. And here's a book for you if you're interested in that. It's by Dr. Stephen Meyer, and it's called Signature in a Cell. If you read that book, you'll understand a lot about science, and you'll also understand a lot about intelligent design. And I pray that that will be a blessing to you. Well, let's do something right now before we all leave and pick up and go. Let's give away some things. What do you think? Does that sound good?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, would you all like to have just a moment for questions before we do that? Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I missed these first three. What are those first three, part one?
Okay, part one, it matters because most people do not understand science. It matters because science is not value neutral. And it matters because of authority. All right, does anyone else have any questions? All right, well, did you enjoy it?
Amen.
All right, well, thanks. Those of you that enjoyed it, why don't we come up here? We're going to give away some books for you today. Now, everything we've done here is a gift from the Winona Seventh-day Adventist Church to you. Yes?
One quick question. Is this paradigm also something called tunnel vision?
No. A paradigm is a theory, it's a hypothesis, it's a worldview, it's the way you think something should be or act. That's a paradigm.
All other views are not
Yes.
allowed.
Are you going to make this available on DVD since you're taping it, or?
What we're hoping to do is we're going to take this presentation and we're going to edit it and put it on the web.
Good.
So if you're interested, keep in touch with the folks at the Winona Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'll give you the website. Or if you look on the bottom of your sheet here, there's a website there. It probably will end up on that website as well. And if you have any questions, that's my email address. You can email me.